Thank you. I would be very happy to talk about this book or indeed anything, any other books or any other things. So if anyone has any questions or comments, do you want to, are you using mics?
Just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic so everyone in the back can hear you.
Are you okay to keep an eye on who's, thank you.
I wonder if you would just talk a little bit about Victor Serge, many of whose books I've read and probably is not familiar to a lot of people in the audience, and they just recently, Richard Grossman and others have put a lot of his stuff back in print. So both his nonfiction and his fiction and his sort of career as a anti-Stalinist leftist to the end of his days in Mexico.
Yeah, the New York Review book series has reissued some of his stuff, hasn't it? I don't know about the other things. So Victor Serge was an extraordinary figure who went through various permutations on the left, started as an anarchist and became ultimately a kind of Trotskyist, but a Trotskyist, so an anti-Stalinist, pro-Bolshevik, but of an unusual and somewhat libertarian stamp. And was in Russia fairly quickly after the revolution and wrote a very powerful book about the immediate aftermath and so on. The thing that, I would recommend anyone to read, his books are amazing, and also there is a wonderful book called The Course is Set on Hope by Susan Weissman, I think, which is a fantastic political biography of Serge, which I recommend very strongly. For my purposes, one of the I didn't have time to get into it, but we do talk about it. I do talk about it in the book. One of the things that's interesting about Serge for me, he is regularly cited, quite rightly and understandably, by anti-Stalinist socialists as a kind of, partly as an alternative tradition, but also because, as you doubtless know, he has this very famous quote where he talks about he is taking to task people who say that there was a kind of inevitable run from Lenin through to Stalin. And he talks about how if you look in the corpse, you can see the germs of lots of different possibilities, and that it's ridiculous. Essentially, it's a beautiful quote, but essentially he's saying it's ridiculous to be so reductive about this. There was a proliferation of possibilities that could have happened, and it's regularly cited as a kind of as an attack on that inevitabilist line of attack on socialism. One of the reasons I'm very interested in that quote, if I had my copy of the book, I would read it to you. But one of the reasons I'm very interested in that quote is because it's actually, I think, somewhat Janus-faced, and a lot of the anti-Stalinist left doesn't engage, I think, adequately with the fact that it is also, as much as an exoneration of a certain Bolshevik tradition, it's also a kind of comradely critique of Bolshevism, because what he moves away from the idea of inevitability. He absolutely clearly says there was nothing inevitable about this. But he does also say that there were threads within the Bolshevik tradition that cleaved in this direction, at least potentially. And I find that very powerful, because sometimes there's a kind of defense from the left where, in a way, it sort of protests too much. And the wonderful thing about Serge is that he never lost his solidarity for that radical tradition and for the revolution itself, but he was very unflinching about criticizing when he thought criticisms were appropriate, and talking about the failures and crimes. A lot of that stuff in the fuller version of the ending, there's Serge is a very defining figure of that chapter, I think, trying to kind of negotiate a line between a kind of solidarity and a critical rigor about the things being done in the revolution's name.
Someone else have a question? Another front rower?
I was going to ask you, what parallels do you see from this period of history that you study and wrote about it, as it applies today? What major social, economic, political themes do you see paralleling into the present world, mostly UK and United States?
Can people hear the question? Yeah, in a way, I want to say two contradictory things to this, because the first thing is I'm very wary of cheap analogies, which get thrown around a lot, and partly it's, one sees this a lot in anyone talking about if they've just written a history book. It's almost de rigueur at some point in the discussion to sort of say, and this has uncanny parallels with today, in a way that is often tendentious. Also on the left, if you come out of a left tradition, there is a kind of sometimes a rather undignified flurry to read off in a very pat way about radical history and now. And I also think it's absolutely crucial that one talks about the specificities of, if there is, one of the key lessons of researching the revolution, the Russian Revolution, is precisely the specificities of that moment of the Russian Empire, of the war hugely, of the shape of industry and economics and so on at that time. So that's a very important kind of qualification and caveat. That said, I think there certainly are certain parallels that I cautiously can't help but see. For me, I think one stands out in particular, which is the sense of apocalypticism in the air. And this is something I've been thinking about and writing about and interested in for a couple of years now, a few years, which is there is a danger in, I think, there is a certain kind of historical arrogance to despair, to saying like, ours is the worst of all possible worlds, that's just the obverse of saying ours is the best of all possible worlds. However, it's also, there's something very complacent about thinking that history simply chugs along without change. And to me, I think that this is the most poisonous political moment in my conscious life. I don't think there's ever been a better moment to be a fascist in my life. In my lifetime, I'm not saying we're in Germany 1933, but and I take that quite seriously, and I think that there are certain kind of social symptoms of that, what Gramsci called morbid symptoms, and for example, I do see this rise, I've written about this, I've tried to kind of think about this, that the rise of a certain kind of performative social sadism taking the place of, or kind of becoming even more generative than what you might have used to have thought of as a kind of, in inverted commas, rational management that inevitably crushed some people. I'm talking about within their terms, and that's just a sort of regrettable side note of history, whereas now that crushing is almost becoming the point in a lot of political practice. And I think that one sees it at all levels in this sense of apocalypticism. I'm very interested in apocalyptic religion and faith, and that sense of ecstatic faith. One of the things that you notice a lot in researching Russia is that partly because the Orthodox Church and the dissenting sects were such a powerful presence and a way of thinking about the world, you see this religiose, this ecstatic formulation for politics across the board. You see it very much from the grassroots. You see, it's quoted in the book, these utterly beautiful letters from like soldiers at the front, completely explicitly saying, our apocalypse has been diverted. We need the king, something started to happen and then it got stalled, and, the kingdom of God was shown us and then it was withdrawn. And this kind of amazing emancipatory tradition expressed in a religious voice, which I find very moving. And it is a religious emancipation that's being sought. I don't want to denigrate the specifically religious aspects. But there's also the ecstatic religion of the far right, these fascist sects for whom, blessed by the Orthodox bishops, for whom killing Jews was a holy act. Again, with all the very important caveats of specificity, I think that sense of kind of apocalypticism, particularly expressed in a religious term, but not only, is something I feel very much today, including in myself. I feel that sense towards apocalypticism, and I don't think that's merely a kind of neurosis. I think something is shifting, and I am very worried.
Another question? Go over here.
Now I feel kind of dumb asking this right after that extremely eloquent answer to a very intelligent question. But I know I work in publishing and we do a lot of reading professionally, and so I was going to ask, I'm sure you do as well, what books you've read maybe in the last year or so that you've just read for pleasure that you recommend to other people, or important books that you feel require recommendation to other people.
So you're not talking about Russia particularly?
No, just
this is
any
not a trick. I just
book
wanna
that
make sure I
you've
understand. Okay.
enjoyed in the last year or so.
Well, a couple of titles, I suppose, come to mind. I have been binging on Anna Kavan. I never know if it's Kavan or Kavan, who wrote Ice and a sequence of utterly beautiful and extraordinary short stories. She's being brought back into print now by Peter Owen, an amazing neglected voice. I read, this is slightly more than a year ago, but close. I read the last book by Michael Sisko, New York writer. In fact, he has a new one from this year, which I haven't finished yet, but which I'm very much enjoying. I think he's one of the very great experimental irrealist writers working today. I think he's utterly extraordinary. So those are two people who jump to my mind. And honestly, those are the ones that are foremost in my head, because I haven't been reading an awful lot apart from Russia stuff for a long time. I can name lots of wonderful Russia books, but they tend to be a bit older. So, yeah, I mean, is that okay to be going along with? If others occur to me along the way, I'll try and write them down. But yeah.
Thank you. Last time I saw you was in London, and you were discussing dystopic cities and J.G. Ballard's The Drowned World. So I'm enjoying hearing you in this quite distinct mode. You've said that when you write your novels, you are not writing them to make political points, but because of your passionate love of monsters. And I'm curious, when you are writing in the nonfiction mode, what it is that you are so passionately pursuing here. If not monsters, then what?
Well, I think for me, this book, like all books really, try to do more than one thing, and often the things they try to do are contradictory, so the job is to try and negotiate that contradiction as best you can and as productively as you can. So the key sort of, if you like, day-to-day aim of this book is very prosaic and simple, and it is to introduce the story of this year in as kind of urgent and narratively exciting a way as possible, using various, my editor described as sort of novelistic tricks, but within an absolutely kind of rigorously researched, no person, no event, no speech is reported that isn't in the literature, so it's not invented from that perspective. And that's simply because, we are in the centenary year of the epochal event of the 20th century, and I would suggest, and indeed hope, beyond. And I think it's it is also, as well as whether or not you have a political relationship to it, it is also, strip all of that out, an amazing story. One of the things that's very interesting about researching it is the number of times. I mean, I've said this before. Forgive me if people have heard me say this, but the number of times that these events happen, where I was very aware, if I were writing this as a story, an editor would just say, you've got to dial that down, it's too much, no one is going to buy that for a second, Like the head of the provisional government, Kerensky, is the son of Lenin's old headmaster, please, no, to be clear, he was, this kind of thing happens all the time. So there is, in a way, kind of unabashedly, part of the project here is that this is an incredible story. And I like I like narrative histories. They have a particular role, and that was, going in, that was a very important thing. And then there's another job, which is that I approach this from a position of political inspiration. I am inspired by this event, and I approach it with a kind of political solidarity. As I say, not an uncritical one, but an absolutely urgent one. And I don't want to pretend that's not the case. So I don't. I think it would be I think it would be very difficult to imagine someone reading this and at the end of the book sort of saying, I have no idea where he stands on this event. I don't think that's it, particularly with the last chapter and so on. But that was not a less important thing. It is very important to me to establish, as far as I am able, that this is an event worthy not just of sort of abstract interest, but urgent, concrete interest, and indeed political power, you know. I suppose the hope is that even if you disagree with the latter, you will still get something from the former. But of course, it's key to me to want to express the latter too. So that's that kind of that pull. I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, I can say that when we were going, I keep using the plural because I worked quite closely with my editor, from the very earliest stages. And one of the things that was interesting was, you know, when we went into planning this, we firmly expected to be jostling for space in a crowded marketplace. We firmly expected there to be a slew of books about the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, February and October, this incredible year. So we were girded. We were like, you know, we need to try and get out there. Let's not publish at the end of the year. Let's bring it out in the middle so that, you know, so people don't have revolution fatigue and so on. No, you know, really not. And that's both, you know, on the one hand, less crowded marketplace. You know, on the other hand, I think that bespeaks something pretty terrible about our political culture. And so there is a sort of extra sense of elegy and urgency to this. By the time I got to the end, towards the end of the draft, and I was beginning to realize we're not going to be fighting for space like I thought we were. Damn, you know.
Hi. Get away from Russia for a minute. Your work has been very highly recommended to me. I would like to know what you think your best. I'd like to know what you think your best book is, and what book you think I should start with. So I'm a little behind the curve.
The question is, what do I think my best book is, and what book do I think someone should start with? I can't answer the second question in the abstract without knowing a little bit more about your taste, but because, I mean, generally, for example, if someone doesn't read very much science fiction or fantasy, I would suggest probably The City and the City is the book that generally people that don't come from that tradition tend to find the easiest thing to get into. If you are, you know, kind of relaxed and au fait with the fantastic tradition, then a lot of people like The Scar, although personally Iron Council is my favorite of those three linked books by some way. I think my favorite is this Census Taker by an enormous margin. I think it's by far the best thing I've done. Now, I should also say a lot of readers disagree. It did not particularly go down well. And I don't say that with a kind of anguish sense. Like I feel very, very committed to that book, utterly committed. It is a complete hinge point for me. But I sort of feel like due diligence, I have to be quite clear about the fact that a lot of people would disagree with me on that. Okay, well. Sure.
Hey, sorry to keep the mic over here, but I want to hold on to the mic over here. Opposite of this guy, I tend to think of myself, you know, I'm an aspiring academic in a grad program, and I've read your edition of Marxism and Fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So a question I have for you, someone gave a lecture at the CUNY Grad Center recently on the city and the city, and I know Carl Friedman's coming out with Art and Idea in your novels. So just like, what are your thoughts on current and or future like exegesis of your work, or fantasy in general? Like, what do you think about that?
Was that audible? Okay. You're particularly asking about theoretical exegesis of my stuff, right? Well, I mean, that's quite a different question. I mean, I'm quite... Okay. I mean, it's very moving when people are minded to kind of theoretically investigate the fiction and so on. And I'm very... I mean, I don't use that word lightly. I mean, when it first started happening, I was very moved because scholarly endeavor was very important to me and indeed is, and, you know, was quite formative for me, and I was going to be an academic for a long time and so on. So I'm not cynical about the possibilities of, you know, the kind of epiphanic possibilities of theoretical engagement. And I find that very powerful when people want to do that. I do also have a set of kind of protocols for myself. I get asked quite a lot by people, for example, doing PhDs or whatnot that involve my things, and quite often I'll get, can I ask you some questions? And basically my answer is no, but from a position of great warmth and gratitude. So not because I'm not interested, I'm extremely interested, but it's partly because of that I feel it's very important for me to butt out. And that's partly simply an expression of failure, because I have never been able to work out a rigorous negotiation of the intentional fallacy. I think it is. I keep thinking that we have, if you like, kind of won the war of the intentional fallacy and established the fact that writers of fiction do not have a monopoly of understanding or wisdom of their own work. This seems to me to be uncontroversial, and yet it isn't. People constantly. I think it's an undying battle, and you hear it like from readers sort of saying, "I wish I could ask the writer what they meant about this," as if that's going to be a master code. And then conversely, and to me much more annoyingly, is when writers sort of say, "Oh, someone said this about my book, but they should have just asked me because that's not what it meant." And I'm always feeling like that's adorable that you think you know what your book meant, But the problem I have is that, of course, I have opinions about my own books in the same way as most people have opinions about the things they write. And pretty much definitionally, I think my opinions are not conclusive or complete, but correct. I think I'm right about the things I think, in what I hope is a non-dogmatic way. And I certainly learn things from what other people say, but I can't. Essentially, I can't work out how to say that without seeming to come across as if I feel like I have a kind of unique insight position onto the text. In an ideal world, the opinions of a writer about their own work would be one datum among many. They wouldn't be unimportant, they wouldn't be irrelevant, but they certainly wouldn't be conclusive, right? But we're not there, and I can't work out how to say, because you can do kind of, well, this is what I think, but obviously what do you think, and so on. I feel like I can only effectively do that if it were anonymous, So I simply can't work out how to speak about it without a kind of implied authority that I don't believe I should have. And for that reason, my default is to say, I think it's best I simply, So for example, I would never go to a seminar about my books unless I was expressly asked to go, and then I would sit at the back and try and be quiet, and I wouldn't, and mostly I would rather not go, but I would wait until my friends who were there came out, and I'd say, what did they say? What did they say? What did they say? So it's a kind of, it's an attempt to find a kind of an honorable way of leaving space, if that makes sense. But that's not lack of interest. It's the exact opposite.
We have time for one or two more questions, maybe from the rear or house right. I'll come around over here.
Hey, my best friend would be really mad at me if I didn't ask this. He wrote a paper about disability studies and your books with Perdido Street Station and Yakarek, and remade as a really important part of it. What were you trying to say anything with that, or how conscious were you of that of those kinds of aspects of the book when you were writing it?
Well, when you say that, do you mean specifically the theoretical body of disability studies?
Or just the idea of remaking as a disabling of a person, of an othering in that particular way?
Well, I have to say that certainly at the time of writing, don't forget these books are old now. I was a lot younger. I certainly wasn't consciously aware beyond the most kind of very vague outlines about the corpus of knowledge of disability studies. So that wasn't a deliberate riff. That said, there was very consciously an attempt to engage with the notion of the bounded body and the notion of the kind of coherent or the sort of somatic Cartesianism and that sense of kind of politicizing that sense of the sort of the punitive remaking, the punitive reshaping of the body, but then trying to invert that through a kind of carnivalesque grotesque that actually ends up celebrating that in certain ways and so on. So it was, you know, and I was very conscious of, for me, a lot of it was to do with carceral politics. It was to do with this sense of the growing social sadism. But certain aspects of, I mean, appropriation is a word that is thrown around much too loosely these days, but certain aspects of an attempt to kind of invert some of those dynamics and so on. So in those terms, yes. Specifically, like, you know, having read disability studies, I would have to say no. So I would moot tentatively that it was a kind of sort of a parallel street and certain kind of penumbra of those studies, but not at a more direct level. I'm going to rely on you to tell me when we're okay for time, right?
Yeah, we've got time for maybe one or two, cool, depending on the quickness of the questions and the length of the answers. So,
on a much, much lighter note, I was going to ask you about your science fiction writer forebears, but an answer you gave to the young lady over there prompted something more specific. I once attended a lecture by Ray Bradbury, in which Mr. Bradbury said that not only the seminal event of the 20th century, but of the first 10,000 years of human civilization was the Apollo landing on the moon. Of course, you just made a remark about the Russian Revolution being the event of the 20th century. I don't want to get into he said, but do you care to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I should preface this by saying I'm not going to say anything particularly rude or aggressive. It's a perfectly good-natured disagreement. But I mean, I speak from someone for whom Bradbury was immensely important, and he's one of those figures who I find myself. One of the things I like is realizing sometime after the event that someone has been influencing you in a way. This is why the question about influence is much more complicated than people often think, because you're very often influenced without realizing it and so on and so forth. So Bradbury, very important figure for me. And he's wrong, because I mean, I disagree. I think essentially for me, I mean, it's not to suggest that, you know, the moon landing or things like that, you know, were not enormously important. Clearly they were, but for me, I think essentially there's an interesting phenomenon, which is that if you are a Marxist, you traditionally, one of the things that you get accused of is a kind of economic reductionism and kind of pulling everything down to a rather crude notion of materialism, which obviously I would argue with. But what's interesting is that there is a certain tradition of enthusiastic, this is not a criticism, by the way, this description, a kind of enthusiastic liberalism, which is, I think, has much too much unmediated faith in technology as essentially a motor of history. And I just don't think it is in that way. I think it is, you know, so to me, it's about sort of, you know, the social and political movements that have a much greater effect. And I mean, the problem is in the 2 minutes available, it's very hard not to sound crude, like I'm counterposing the two. I mean, because it would be absurd to sort of talk about, you know, to suggest that technological advancement hasn't had enormous social impacts. Clearly it has. But for me, what I'm most interested in terms of the kind of driving forces of what change societies are these shifts in sort of the culture and politics. So, you know, with all respect and love to Bradbury, I think that I both think and hope that, you know, 100 years from now, important as the Apollo mission was and will be, the Russian Revolution will be more so. We got time for one more, or we
can take one last question. Go on, right over here.
Okay, so talking about technology as a motor of history and an abundance of wonderful train metaphors earlier on in this talk, where do you see yourself going next? Are you interested in addressing other points in history in particular? Is my question.
You mean as a writer, what I want to write about?
Yes.
I like writing nonfiction, but I find it extreme. No, I don't. That's not true. I really hate writing nonfiction. But I love having written it, you know, and I find it incredibly hard and incredibly wrenchingly hard work and anxiety generative and so on. I hate writing fiction too, but in a different way. And I think that for me, the center of gravity will always be fiction when I'm writing. I would love to get to but I have been doing a lot more nonfiction recently. With several other people, we started a journal called Salvage, and I've been writing, which I would encourage people to go to salvage.zone and subscribe. We need subscriptions. And I've been writing a lot more essays, political essays, and so on. So I have been doing more fiction, which is part of this sense of political urgency that I do feel at the moment. But there is a relief to being able to go back to fiction. But so it's kind of conflicting rhythms. And I would love to get to a stage where I was able to write, you know, say 2 or 3 fiction books and then a non-fiction book, kind of oscillating like that. There are things that get thrown up after this book that I think, again, relating to this idea of thinking there was going to be a lot more of this kind of thing out there. You know, the Civil War cries out for a book like this, you know, and I would love to be able to, or you know, and then going back further in history, the Paris Commune, for example, you know, calls out for a book like this sort of thing. So I'd love to be able to do that kind of thing. And I have kind of a series of ideas in a notebook, but it has been you know, I have been working on this book very hard for at least 2.5 years. I can't even remember, and I have put various other things on hold, and I need to. It felt like clenching the whole time, and that's fine. Clenching is important, but I now need to do a different thing. So I'm definitely going to do some fiction first, but I'd like to be able to certainly in the short term do some essays, and I'm sure there will be more books. I'm not going to say what they are because then I'm going to jinx. God will laugh, you know. Never tell God what you're going to do. So, what's that? What they won't be, yeah. They won't be many things, but yeah. So yes, I definitely want to do more nonfiction, but it's a question of, and I feel more and more urgent the older I get, and so I you know, big fan of modafinil. You know, I want to speed up.
Well, whatever form your work takes next, I'm so grateful you could be here tonight. Let's
Thank
give it
you
up
for having me.
Chandler.
Thank you very much for coming.